These days, in 2011, a lot of students are reading about and thinking about an issue that has been getting more and more coverage, namely the growth of inequality in the United States, the widening gap between the wealthiest Americans and everyone else. And of course, this is not the first time in American history where there has been concern about that growing gap, that growth of inequality. And really, it's in the late 19th century, in the Gilded Age, I think, that this issue first becomes squarely in the center of American life. We associate the Gilded Age with an enormous expansion of American industry, American manufacturing, the growth of the factory system. It's also the moment when it's increasingly clear that large numbers of Americans are going to be doing wage labor for all their life. We may think that's no big deal today, but in fact, before the Civil War, most Americans thought of themselves not as wage workers, but as people who either were landowners, who aspired to own land, farmers, other agricultural laborers, people who owned shops, people who might have trades. And the whole idea of independence in economic and political terms was very closely connected to the idea of economic independence, the idea that anybody, any man certainly, could make his way, make a living, own land, have a shop, be a tradesman, have a business. In the late 19th century, that whole model, that whole vision is increasingly less and less available to Americans. As more and more Americans are working for wages and have no opportunity to get out of the wage system, that kind of economic independence is increasingly difficult to attain. It's also the case that in the late 19th century, more and more Americans, particularly working class people, are more vulnerable to the economic downturns that we associate with a modern capitalist economy. So that every 20 years or so, in 1873, for example, in 1893, there are long, very difficult, even brutal depressions that throw millions of Americans into impoverishment. There's also a growing sense, I think, in those years of the hardening of class lines. That goes along with the rise of wage labor, the factory system, and the growth of manufacturing. The idea that the United States is never going to have classes in the way that the old world did now looks, by the late 19th century, more and more like an illusion. That is to say, it's increasingly clear that the United States, as a growing modern capitalist economy, is going to have a permanent wage class, is going to have impoverishment, and the question of what to do about that is also increasingly on the public front burner, if you will, because of the growing number of strikes, the growing violence and class conflict in places like Homestead in 1892 outside of Pittsburgh, or the epical Pullman strike of the railroad system in 1894. In both of those instances and many others, American newspapers, American politicians, American public figures of all kinds are showing increasing concern about the hardening of class conflict and what seems to be a more or less permanent class of unemployed or underemployed people. This is the moment where we get the phrase or the words, the tramp, referring to the many, many thousands of people who have to travel to find work. It's also the moment where we get the word millionaire to describe somebody who has made $1 million, which in the 1890s seemed to be an unbelievable sum. So for all these reasons, a growth in poverty and also a growth in awareness of poverty is something that we associate with the late 19th century. And of course, one of the most influential chroniclers of the growth of poverty was the Danish immigrant journalist Jacob Riis, who in 1890 published his landmark, How the Other Half Lives, which used photographs, really the first social documentary photographs we have, along with a text, to document the lives of New York City's tenement poor, many of whom were immigrants, many of whom seemed trapped in a system that had no place for them.